Now, what I'd like to do is start out by mentioning a couple of inventions that made aircraft carriers possible. Obviously, the advent of the aircraft is the major invention that produced aircraft carriers, but let's move back a little bit more in history. On 9 March 1814, Congress authorized the construction of the first warship to be powered by steam. She was designed by Robert Fulton, who was the inventor of the first commercially successful steamboat in North America. The ship was commissioned on 29 October 1815, and Fulton had wanted to call her the Demologos, which is Greek for voice of the people. But unfortunately, in February of 1815, Fulton passed away, and in his honor, the Navy commissioned the ship as USS Fulton. Now, a unique and ingenious system was used for the paddle wheels on Fulton. They were placed in the center of the ship, and they were sandwiched between two watertight compartments, one holding the boiler and the other holding the steam engine. In this way, a major problem of using paddle wheels for a warship was avoided, in that Fulton's paddle wheels were protected from enemy gunfire. Now, Fulton could make about 5.5 knots in favorable weather, and her ability to steer independently of the wind was a major step forward toward the eventual development of aircraft carriers, although, of course, nobody realized this at the time. But aircraft carriers, in order to launch their aircraft, steer directly into the wind, and this is something that a sailing ship simply cannot do. Now, on 9 September 1843, the Navy commissioned the USS Princeton. This is the first Navy ship to be fitted with a propeller. Princeton was a 710-ton corvette, and she was named for the city of Princeton, New Jersey. She's also a perfect example of the transition-type ships that were being built during the time that steam was gradually replacing sail. Now, the efficiency of a propeller is about the same as the efficiency of a paddle wheel. But paddle wheels tend to lose a great deal of their efficiency if a seaway causes the ship to roll. On the other hand, propellers are relatively, propellers are relatively unaffected by the roll of a ship as long as they remain underwater. In addition, a propeller is less complex, fits in a smaller space, and easier to maintain than a paddle wheel. And this is the main reason why the propeller has basically taken over as the source of power for practically all ships of the world. Now, in 26 June 1917, the British commissioned the HMS Furious, which, to the best of my knowledge, is the first flight deck aircraft carrier. Furious was supposed to be, and was initially being built as a battle cruiser, but late in her construction, the British changed to an aircraft carrier, and they put a flight deck on her right here forward of her superstructure. This large black part here is an aircraft elevator, and then here's the flight deck. But this meant that aircraft had to fly around the superstructure when they were trying to land, and then side slip into the flight deck, a rather ticklish operation at best. So in December of 1917, an afterdeck was added to the ship behind the superstructure, but this proved to be useless because the heavy turbulence generated by the superstructure made it impossible for aircraft to land. However, Furious made aircraft carrier history when on 19 July 1918, she launched 7 Sopwith Camels that flew approximately 80 miles to bomb the Zeppelin or dirigible sheds at Tondern, Germany. This was the first successful aircraft carrier attack in history. However, the aircraft that returned to the ship had to ditch in the water alongside their unlandable carrier. The pilots were rescued and the aircraft sank. That's a rather expensive way of doing flight operations. But nonetheless, Furious had shown that aircraft carriers could project military power far beyond the range of a battleship's big guns. Now, the first aircraft carrier to look something like a modern aircraft carrier was the converted liner HMS Argus. It was commissioned on 16 September 1918. And She had a large flat wooden deck built over the entire length of her hull and no superstructure, no island or funnels. This provided a large takeoff and landing area that was unaffected by turbulence. These stack gases were piped through the after part of the ship and ejected under the fantail. You can see them right here. But a couple of problems arose. First of all, because of the stack gases, aircraft that were landing were finding themselves subjected to a sudden unwelcome upward push just as they were landing on the ship. And in addition, the engineers had put the bridge forward under the flight deck, and this proved to be too visually restrictive for proper navigation. So they built a small pilot house right on top of the flight deck. Now obviously, this is going to interfere with aircraft, so we actually have a short film of the Argus, and I'm going to show it to you and show how they solved that problem. If I can get this to work, you'll have to bear with me for a couple of minutes while I try to figure out how to get the cursor in place. Right now we've lost it. Well, let's see, we'll work on it some more. These people are waiting for the aircraft to arrive on the flight deck. This is the pilot house I was talking about, and as you can see, they've made it so it retracts into the flight deck. And I thought you might like to see the type of aircraft that they use. That this is the 1920s now. Okay, back to our talk. Now, Argus had a fairly long career, and she actually fought during the Second World War. However, the ship that you're looking at now is the USS Langley. Langley was commissioned on 20 March 1922 as our first aircraft carrier for the United States. Now, she was converted from a ship called the USS Jupiter that had been commissioned in 1913. Jupiter was a coal collier, is what they called it at the time. That means a coal hauler. And from the time that steam became dominant to the early 1920s, the U.S. Navy used coal for fuel, so coal haulers were a very important ship. But in the early 1920s, the Navy shifted from coal to oil for fuel, and so the Jupiter was somewhat out of a job and readily available for conversion. Now, Langley was always considered to be an experimental ship, and it was never intended that she go into battle. In fact, by the time of the Second World War, she'd been converted to a seaplane tender and was technically no longer a flight deck carrier. Now, the next aircraft carrier to be important is the Japanese IJN Hosho. IJN stands for Imperial Japanese Navy. Hosho is the first aircraft carrier in history to be built from the ground up as an aircraft carrier instead of being converted from another ship. Now, Hosho was a fairly small carrier, particularly as the Japanese developed more carriers. She was relegated to training duties, and so she stayed in the home waters and trained pilots how to land and take off on an aircraft carrier, and she accomplished something which is extremely rare for Japanese aircraft carriers of that period. She survived the war, and she was not actually taken out of service until around early 1946. Now, during the First World War, the Americans, British, French, Italians, and Japanese had been allies. But with the German threat seemingly eliminated, a naval arms race among the former allies seemed likely for the next several years. President Woodrow Wilson had already announced plans for expanding the American Navy, but a naval arms race was unwelcome to the American public. Congress disapproved of Wilson's plans and had no enthusiasm for further naval expansion. Great Britain's economy had been seriously injured by the First World War and could ill afford to continue building battleships considering their exorbitant cost. And these considerations led the five former allies to convene the Naval Washington Conference of 1921. And this conference produced the Naval Washington Treaty of 1922. This treaty severely limited the number and total tonnage of capital ships that could be maintained by the signers of the treaty. There was a provision in the treaty, however, that allowed for the building of 2 aircraft carriers from existing construction. And the United States at the time was building 6 battle cruisers. So we converted 2 of the battle cruisers to aircraft carriers, and we scrapped the rest. And these 2 became the USS Lexington, CV-2, which is right here, and the USS Saratoga, CV-3. Okay, now the treaty was supposed to run until 1936, at which time it was expected to be renewed. But in 1934, pursuing their expansionist policies in Asia, Japan openly refused to abide by the terms of the treaty. And in 1936, the treaty expired without being extended. After the abrogation of the treaty, the United States took a realistic look at its Navy, and in 1938, Congress passed the Naval Expansion Act, which allowed for the building of the USS Hornet, the last of the Yorktown class, and the building of 3 new aircraft carriers that would be unaffected by treaty restrictions. These 3 new Essex-class carriers were to be significantly larger than the Yorktown class, but not as large as the CV-2 or the CV-3. Now, the reason why the Navy wanted larger carriers is that they wanted to be able to carry 2 squadrons of each type of aircraft, the fighter, the dive bomber, and the torpedo bomber, that were used by aircraft carriers. But the advent of the TBF Avenger torpedo bomber from Douglas, this aircraft was simply too large for the plans to accommodate 2 squadrons. So the final loadout for the Essex-class carrier became 36 fighters, 36 dive bombers, but only 18 torpedo bombers, only 1 squadron of torpedo bombers. And on the last day of 1942, the USS Essex was commissioned. But before that, let me mention that war clouds were still arising again. And in 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, which is the beginning of the Second World War. And in 1940, the Chief of Naval Operations, Chief Admiral Harold Stark, approached Congress to expand the Navy further. And in 1940, Congress passed the Two-Ocean Navy Act. And this act provided, among other things, for 8 more Essex-class carriers, one of which, of course, was Lexington. Now, as I was about to mention, on the last day of 1942, the Essex was commissioned as the first of a class of ships that were the most significant in naval history. The advent of the Essex-class carrier marked the beginning of a new era of naval power based on fast carrier task forces instead of on battleships. Now, to understand why the Essex-class carrier is built the way it is, one needs to know that in American carrier doctrine, offensive capabilities take precedent over defensive qualities. The ability to operate large air groups successfully is considered to be more important than passive armor protection. After all, the more armor protection that an aircraft carrier carries, the less airplanes it can carry. And this is why on the Essex-class carrier, including our Lexington, the main armor protection, the 2.5-inch armor plate, is on the hangar deck instead of on the flight deck. By not putting heavy armor high up on the flight deck, we can carry more aircraft. Simple as that. Now, one of the really outstanding characteristics of the Essex-class carrier is her engineering plant, composed of 2 independent engine rooms, each producing about 75,000 shaft horsepower, for a total of 150,000 shaft horsepower, and in addition, the 4th deck having a 1.25-inch armor plate also, which runs, among other places, directly over the engine rooms, makes it much harder for battle damage to put the ship out of action. The turbines that we have for our engines, direct drive turbines, were originally designed for the Atlanta-class cruiser, which means they were designed for high speed. And these turbines, plus the type of power that we're developing, 150,000 shaft horsepower, could drive the ship when she was new at about 33.5 knots top speed. That's about 38 miles an hour. Now, those of you who are somewhat familiar with engineering plants may know that taking a direct drive turbine and driving it backward, that is making the ship go astern, is extremely wearing on the turbine. If we were to travel, if a normal ship was to travel at high speed backward, they would wear out their turbines extremely rapidly. However, the Essex-class carriers, including Lexington, have a modification, and we are capable of steaming backward at 20 knots and keeping it up for 1 hour without damaging our turbines. And the reason for this was that if the unarmored flight deck received battle damage at the rear end, where it would make normal landing impossible, then we can steam astern at 20 knots and take aircraft in over the bow. It's a very interesting, no other aircraft carrier class has ever, prior to us, has ever done that. Now, we were fitted for the middle elevator with an edge deck elevator. If I can get my thing to work here. There we go. Right here, of course, is the edge deck elevator. And the reason why we have an edge deck elevator there was so that they could avoid weakening the hangar deck armor plate by punching a large hole in it for an elevator pit. The after elevator, which during the Second World War is a midships elevator, not an edge deck elevator like it is now, was put directly behind the superstructure so there would be space behind it to make available for repairing aircraft without interfering with the hangar deck traffic pattern. There were a couple of design faults, however, that occurred, as they often do, and unfortunately they were not discovered till the ship went into battle. But the ready rooms for the pilots were placed right on the gallery deck, right under the flight deck, and this made them unnecessarily exposed to battle damage because the flight deck is unarmored. Also, to avoid further weakening the hangar deck armor plate by punching holes in it for ventilation ducts, ventilation for the lower decks was supplied by one single long duct that went the entire length of the ship and took in air from both ends. Now, the problem with this was that if it's underneath the armor plate, it runs on the overhead of the second deck, and if we get battle damage at the end of the ship, or if battle damage penetrates this duct, then it will also suck in smoke and burning gases and spread them throughout the entire lower level. This was a problem to the Lexington in December of 1943 when she was hit by a torpedo, and it was almost fatal to the USS Franklin when she was hit by two 500-pound bombs in 1945. Now, our ship, the Lexington, was commissioned on February 17, 1943, as the second Essex-class carrier to go into commission. And this brings up an interesting story, an interesting question that is occasionally asked by visitors. We know that the Essex is the CV-9, and if the CV-9 was the first Essex carrier to be commissioned, how is it that the second Essex carrier is CV-16? And the answer is very simply that lineal numbers of Navy ships are assigned to the ship when the ship is ordered by Congress, not when she is commissioned. The contracts for CV-9 through CV-15 were given to Newport News Shipyard in Virginia, but the contracts for 16 through 19 were given to the Fore River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, and we're number 16, so that's the first one they started on. So as Newport News was building the Essex, the Fore River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts was building the Lexington, so that's how we got to be the second Essex-class carrier to be put into commission. Now, we were commissioned on February 17, 1943, and our first major battle was the invasion of Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands. And what I want to do quickly is run over the chart of the Pacific, so otherwise it might get a little bit confusing. But this is over here. I got it on. Can I get it? Anyway, yeah. Here's the main Hawaiian Islands. Here's Midway, which is part of the Hawaiian Island chain. Here's Wake Island. Here are the Marshall Islands. Right under them are the Gilbert Islands, where Tarawa is located. And then going further west are the Carolina Islands. Ulithi Harbor is there, if you hear about that. Above that is the Marshall Islands, where Saipan is located. And then you have Iwo Jima, and then Okinawa, and then Japan. And of course, down here are the Philippines, which we'll also be talking about. Okay, now, the important thing to understand is that Tarawa is the name for an atoll, a group of islands in the Gilberts. The actual island that we invaded was called Baisio. Here's a picture of Baisio and some more of the Tarawa Atoll. This was done in two phases. In September of 1943, we participated in a reconnaissance raid, and in that raid, aircraft from our ship, from the Lexington, took the pictures of the beaches of Baisio that the Marines used to decide where they were going to land. The second phase, which was in November of 1943, we were in a blocking position halfway between the Marshall Islands and the Gilbert Islands so that we could intercept aircraft flying south from Kwajalein Atoll to take part in the battle. We intercepted 20 Japanese aircraft. We shot down 17 of them. A very interesting thing happened during this time. The F-6F Hellcat was a relatively new aircraft. It had only been introduced in January of 1943. And we had a young Hellcat driver by the name of Eugene Ralph Hanks on board. And in his mission, he shot down 5 Japanese aircraft, thus becoming the first ace in a day for the Hellcat. Now, I want to emphasize he was not the first person to shoot down 5 Japanese aircraft in a Hellcat. He was the first person to do it in one day and get the Ace in the Day award. And the interesting thing is it was his first combat mission. He'd never flown in combat before. Anyway, after the invasion of Tarawa, we participated in a raid against Wake Island, which was more of a earn while you learn time in the Pacific, sort of an exercise. And then on December 4th, 1943, we participated in a raid against Kwajalein here in the Marshall Islands. And it was at this point the Lexington was struck with an airdrop torpedo in the starboard side in the vicinity of the number 2 propeller. The torpedo hit, broke off the number 2 propeller, and it jammed the rudder at 22 degrees left. The ship was going around and around in a circle, and she could not steer. She could not leave the battle area. The rudder mechanism itself was not damaged, but the two electrical motors that drove the hydraulic pumps that made the rudder move had been destroyed. Now, there were 4 men in the after steering compartment. This is a compartment underneath the waterline and close to the rudder that holds all the equipment for operating the rudder, including these 2 motors that I mentioned. One of the men was knocked out. There was smoke coming in through the ventilators, making it difficult to breathe. The men were trapped in the compartment because the vertical access trunk to the compartment had flooded with water, so they couldn't get out. And just to make everything complete, the compartment was slowly flooding with water. Nonetheless, the other 3 men, using a specially designed, hand-driven hydraulic pump, this pump had been designed and installed by the Lexington crew themselves. It was not part of the original plans. And using this pump and a couple of ingenious ideas that they thought up, they managed to bring the rudder from 22 degrees left to 2 degrees left, thus saving the ship. We were able to sail back to Pearl Harbor, steering by using varying speed on our engines. There were 9 people that were killed by this torpedo attack. 7 of them were a repair party in a compartment close to where the torpedo hit, and 2 of them were on the fantail. But these 4 men were actually rescued. I just wanted to let you know they were saved. They managed to survive. Now, we got back to Pearl Harbor, and then they jury-rigged the rudder so it could be used again, and then we sailed for Bremerton Naval Shipyard in Washington, where we underwent a 2-month repair. And during this repair, we also got some rather important upgrades. One of the upgrades was we got 3 40-millimeter Bofors anti-aircraft batteries on sponsons. There's 1 here, 1 here, and 1 here on the starboard side. And we also got the first height-finding radar that had been introduced into the Pacific. So when on February 15th we left the shipyard ready for battle, we were the only ship in the Pacific to have a height-finding radar. And it is my belief, I suppose, that this is the reason that eventually Admiral Mitcher, who we'll talk about later, selected Lexington to be his flagship. Now, subsequent to this repair period, Lexington participated in practically every battle of the Pacific War, with the exception of Iwo Jima invasion and the invasion of Okinawa. I know Iwo Jima and Okinawa are mentioned on this list, but they refer to previous raids against the islands, not the actual invasion. We were home for an overhaul during the Iwo Jima Okinawa period, but we earned 11 battle stars, and in our combat record, we became the 3rd most decorated aircraft carrier of the United States Navy. Now, I think our most interesting and probably most important battle was on the occasion of the invasion of Saipan in the Mariana Islands. This was in June of 1944, and by this time the Japanese warlords had realized that they were either going to have to halt the American advance or they were going to lose the war, and they sortied their entire carrier force to oppose this landing. Now, reconnaissance reports from our submarines warned us that the Japanese were on the way, and Admiral Spruance, who was commander of 5th Fleet, to which we were attached, we are part of Task Force 58, by the way, and Spruance is basically in charge of the entire Saipan operation. So he placed Task Force 58, which is our carrier battle force, west of Saipan to protect the invasion forces from the oncoming Japanese. And this resulted in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. This is not a very well-known battle to the public. It's not nearly as famous as Midway or Guadalcanal or perhaps even Coral Sea, but it was the largest aircraft carrier battle in the war, and probably will be the largest aircraft carrier battle in history. We had 15 aircraft carriers present, and the Japanese had 9. Now, when I say aircraft carrier battle, that is implying that the ships of opposing sides never saw each other. The battle was conducted entirely by aircraft. Now, at the time of this battle, we were flagship for Admiral Mitcher, who is a very famous admiral of the Pacific War. He's the commander of Task Force 58, our carrier battle group. That means he commands all 15 aircraft carriers and the supporting ships, the battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that compose Task Force 58. Mitchell was a very famous admiral. Some historians say that he was the father of World War II aircraft carrier tactics. And we're not really sure if that's true or not, but in any case, we are very proud that we were his flagship during this very important battle. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Navy lingo, anytime an admiral goes aboard an active duty Navy ship or naval station, a special flag is raised for him. It's just this blue flag, and the number of stars from the flag are equal to the rank of the admiral. And basically, all it does is say, this is where the admiral is located. So when we say that we were flagship for Admiral Mitchell, that means Mitchell was located here on the Lexington. He actually directed the American side of this famous battle from Lexington herself. Okay, now, I want to go very briefly over the chain of command because it might get confusing otherwise. There's some things that are a little bit special about it. Obviously, right up at the top is President Roosevelt, Commander-in-Chief, and then for the Navy in Washington is Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations and Commander of the Navy. He wore both hats. And then just to include him for the Army is George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff. Now under King, in the Pacific at Pearl Harbor is Chester Nimitz. He commands all of the Pacific except for a small area called the Southwest Pacific, which was under General MacArthur's command. Under Nimitz is Admiral Spruance, Commander of 5th Fleet, and Admiral Halsey, Commander 3rd Fleet. But the secret is, these are the same ships. While Spruance is conducting a mission, Halsey is back in Pearl Harbor planning the next mission. And then when Spruance's mission is over, the two change places, and Halsey comes into command. Everybody is now called 3rd Fleet, and Task Force 58 becomes Task Force 38, but they're all the same ships. They're not two different fleets. Okay, now, continuing on, underneath Spruance is Admiral Mark Mitchell, Commander of Task Force 58. That's the carrier battle group, and the invasion forces are under Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. And then, of course, our ship, Lexington, commanded by Captain Litch, is under Mitchell. So, on the 19th of June, the morning thereof, the Japanese admiral decided that he was at a proper attack position, and he launched some 370 aircraft against our forces. But his pilots had a couple of serious problems. First of all, because of a very successful American submarine campaign against Japanese merchant shipping, the Japanese were having extreme difficulty getting supplies of aviation fuel into the home islands. As a result, they were unable to train new pilots. They had lost a great deal of their experienced pilots in previous engagements, and so all of the new pilots in this raid had had only a minimum of flight training. But they had an even more serious problem, and that was, by this time in the war, the American carriers had honed the technique of radar-controlled interception of enemy aircraft to a high degree of skill. It was the duty of the shipboard radar controllers to detect and track incoming enemy aircraft and then issue orders over the radio to their defending fighters how they should fly so as to make a proper intercept. Now, this required a great deal of teamwork. The controllers had to trust that the pilots were going to fly where they told them to go, and the pilots had to trust that they were being placed in optimum attack position. But by this time in the war, all the wrinkles in this system had been smoothed out, and the system was operating to a high degree of efficiency. On the Japanese side, however, the relatively untrained Japanese pilots seemed to have no formal defense strategy, and this hurt their prospects seriously. Of the 370 Japanese aircraft launched that morning, 240 of them were shot down that day. On our side, we lost 30 aircraft, and none of our ships were seriously damaged. There was a fighter pilot on our side landing to be resupplied with gasoline and ammunition, and he just happened to mention it's like an old-time turkey shoot up there. His squadron commander overheard the remark, passed it on, and the next thing we know, the battle goes down in the history books as the Marianas Turkey Shoot. And just so you know, it was a Lexington pilot that made that remark. Okay, so now, Admiral Ozawa, the Japanese admiral, on the evening of the 19th, having lost some 2/3 of his attack force for no particular profit, decided not to renew the battle on the next day, but he turned his ships to the west and told them to head for home. But Mitcher wanted to get those Japanese carriers because he didn't want them showing up at the next battle. However, during the heavy fighting, we had not had the opportunity of launching scout planes to look for the position of the Japanese aircraft carriers. They were over the horizon out of sight somewhere. So early the next day, on the 20th, we launched our scout planes, but it was not until late afternoon that they found the position of the Japanese carriers, and they were at extreme range. But nonetheless, Mitcher ordered a launch, and in a very short time thereafter, some 216 of our aircraft were headed for the Japanese. Now, what I'm showing you here is the venerable old Douglas Dauntless SBD dive bomber. I'm mentioning that specifically because we have one of them on board, and that one is an actual warbird. It was assigned to Mag 13 during the war. The Dauntless first flew in 1937, so by his time in the war, 1944, it's pretty much obsolete. The aircraft is noisy, is drafty, and is slow. Typical cruising speed is around 180 miles an hour. Top speed, 252 miles in level flight, whereas your Hellcat could make almost 400 miles an hour. In fact, when Hellcats were escorting SBDs, they had to fly S-curves over the squadron to go slow enough that the bombers could keep up with them. But this is the aircraft that sank the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers at Midway. It's a very easy plane to fly, and it was very stable, particularly in this 70-degree dive that is the hallmark of our American dive bombers. No other nation during the Second World War dove their bombers as steeply as we did. And the pilots on Lexington just loved the old bird. It's called an SBD, which stands for Scout Bomber Douglas. But the pilots on Lexington said, no, that's not what it means. What it really means is slow but deadly. Okay, no sooner had our aircraft gotten off on their way, our 216 aircraft, than a navigational error was discovered, and it was determined that the Japanese were actually 60 miles further away than had been previously reported. Now, this brought up 2 very serious problems. First of all, several of our aircraft were simply not going to have enough gasoline to make it all the way to the Japanese, make an attack, and make it all the way back. But they had an additional problem. Because of the late hour of the launch, around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they would reach the Japanese position just at sundown. They would have enough gasoline for an attack, but then they were going to have to fly back in the dark. It was going to be a really rough time because it was going to be a moonless night, and during the Second World War, American naval aviators were not normally trained to fly at nighttime. So they're going to have a really difficult time getting back. As they were coming back, however, Mitcher made a very bold and daring decision, and he ordered, "Turn on the lights." Now, these were hostile waters. It was well known that submarines might be present, but every ship in the task force turned their lights on. The ones with the large signal searchlights swung them skyward to form a column of light going up as a beacon for the returning aircraft. And because of this action, and because the next day Mitcher conducted a very thorough air-sea rescue mission to pick up all the pilots that had run out of gasoline and had to ditch in the ocean, of the 216 aircraft that we launched, we lost 16 pilots and 33 crew members. Now, any loss is tragic, but when you consider what the loss could have been had Mitcher not done this, it's very small by comparison. On the Japanese side, however, of the 370 aircraft that they were launched at the beginning of the battle, the Japanese carriers had 35 active aircraft left. The Japanese carrier force never recovered from this blow, and for the rest of the war, they were unable to mount large carrier operations. Now, if the Battle of the Philippine Sea was the most important engagement for the USS Lexington, then surely the Battle of Leyte Gulf is the next most important engagement for the Lexington. This occurred on 23 to 26 October of 1944 and was on the occasion of General MacArthur invading Leyte Island, which is one of our early steps on attempting to regain the Philippines. The Japanese sortied what was left of their navy to try and oppose this invasion. And their idea was to break into two forces. One force would come through San Bernardino Strait right here, and one force would come through Surigao Strait here. And in this way, they would hit the invasion forces from both sides, isolating them and destroying them. Now, their main concern was Third Fleet. Now, that's us, Fifth Fleet, but now it's Third Fleet from Halsey's in charge. Third Fleet was sitting right off San Bernardino Strait. So they had Admiral Ozawa with 4 aircraft carriers, which was all they could scrape up, come south. And he had most of the aircraft that he was carrying were reassigned to land bases. So the time he got down to this position, he had only 35 aircraft left. But he was going to be a decoy force and hopefully draw Third Fleet north, away from San Bernardino Strait. Now, both Admiral Kurita and Admiral Nishimura came up from Borneo, which is where the main forces of the Japanese were left. And they had a fairly large number of surface ships combat ready still left, including the 2 largest battleships in the world. The Musashi and the Yamato carried 18.5-inch large guns that could throw a shell that weighed about the same as a modern automobile up to 26 miles. So Kurita and Nishimura split right at this point here. Kurita goes north and Nishimura goes this way to arrive at the Surigao Strait. And Admiral Shima, with 1 battleship, 1 cruiser, and a couple of destroyers, comes down this way to reinforce Nishimura. But he's late because nobody has bothered to tell him what Nishimura is doing. Japanese communications at this point were absolutely miserable. So Nishimura runs into 7th Fleet, which is sitting off Surigao Strait. That fleet is actually under the overall command of General MacArthur, but he has a couple of admirals, Admiral Ohlendorf and Admiral Kincaid, to run the Navy for him, and Nishimura gets annihilated. He himself sinks with his own flagship. Shima, who's coming down late, runs into all these Japanese battleships and cruisers that are sinking and says, I can see what's happening here, and he turns around and leaves. Okay, so Kurita, coming up this way, loses 3 heavy cruisers in the Palawan Passage, which is this area right here. They're sunk by our U.S. submarines. He comes up this way, and when he gets close to San Bernardino Strait, he is attacked by aircraft from Third Fleet, including aircraft from Lexington. They managed to sink the Musashi, that large battleship. So Kurita turns around and he heads west. Now, his reason for doing that, I seem to have lost my pointer, so we'll have to go without. His reason for heading west was he wanted to get closer to Japanese land-based air to get some air support, although unfortunately the air support never shows up. And he also wanted to go through San Bernardino Strait at nighttime when there was less chance of being attacked. Halsey misunderstands this move of Kurita, and in the largest mistake that he made in his career, he takes Third Fleet north to intercept the Japanese carriers coming down and leaves San Bernardino Strait unguarded. So the next morning, after going through San Bernardino Strait at night, Kurita turns south, and off Samar Island he hits Taffy 3. Now Taffy 3, Taffy 2, and Taffy 1 were groups of escort carriers that were there basically to provide ground air support for the invasion. And each escort carrier has 1 5-inch 38 gun on it. That's their only protection. And they also have 4 destroyers. This is Taffy 3, has 4 destroyers and 3 destroyer escorts, and that's all they've got for protection. And all of a sudden, they're seeing Japanese battleships, heavy cruisers, and loads of destroyers coming down on them. The 4 destroyers and 3 destroyer escorts, plus aircraft from Taffy 3 and Taffy 2, attack Kurita with such ferocity and such disregard for their own safety that Kurita thinks he's running into Third Fleet, because nobody has bothered to tell him that Halsey went north. This is the miserable communications. that the Japanese had at that time, and so he thinks it's Third Fleet, and snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, he turns around and heads for home. Now, we are going north with Halsey. We do intercept the Japanese carriers. What I was told was that it was actually a scout plane from the Lexington that first found the position of the carriers, where they really were. But in any event, the entire 38th Task Force launches aircraft to go after the carriers. But the person who is in charge of the on-the-scene commander who's flying in an aircraft, who is in charge of telling what aircraft to go where, tells all the aircraft to stay away from the aircraft carrier Zuikaku is the way it's pronounced, and aircraft from the Lexington sink the Zuikaku. Now that's kind of important because Zuikaku is the lone survivor of the 6 aircraft carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor. So we got the last carrier that attacked Pearl Harbor. And the other 4 carriers were also sunk by other aircraft carriers, ships from other aircraft carriers. So, okay, that's the Battle of the Leyte Gulf. Now, after the war was close to an end, or that is to say, right at the end of the war, Lexington was off the shores of Japan conducting air raids against Japanese air bases on the home islands when the surrender was announced. She actually had to call her pilots on the radio and say, drop your bombs in the sea, come home to the ship, the war's over. Now, a very interesting legend has grown up about this particular incident. We have never been able to verify that this legend is true. But it was published in Reader's Digest shortly after the war, so I'll tell it to you just for what it's worth. According to the legend, no sooner had our aircraft landed on the ship, we're all celebrating the war's end, I mean, and all of a sudden our radars pick up an incoming Japanese raid. Well, what do we do now? So we called Admiral Halsey and we said, hey, we've got this incoming raid, what do we do? And Halsey answered, Japan has surrendered. All hostilities are to cease immediately. And if those aircraft get any closer, shoot them down in a friendly fashion. Well, fortunately, they never got any closer, so we didn't have to do that. Now, after the war was over, Lexington served with the Far Eastern Fleet until 1947. Then on April 23, 1947, she was officially decommissioned and placed in mothballs in the Puget Sound area. But then the Korean War broke out, and all of a sudden the United States realized we need aircraft carriers after all. And so shortly after the Korean War, Lexington's turn came, and in 1953 she was taken back out of mothballs and placed in Bremerton Naval Shipyard, where they practically made a new ship out of her. This is where the angle deck was put on her. The midline elevator was transferred to an edge deck elevator, where it is now. The superstructure was extensively revised. The forward deck area under the bow was enclosed. It was not enclosed during the war. It is now. And let's see, what else new? Well, our hydraulic catapults were upgraded to steam catapults. And then on August 15th, 1955, she was recommissioned and she rejoined the Pacific Fleet. And she continued there until 1962, at which time she was transferred to Naval Air Training Command and officially designated as the training carrier for the United States Navy. Now, a very interesting story, which we do know is true. As the Lexington left the Pacific for the last time, the oldest aircraft carrier in the United States Navy, going around Cape Horn, she met the USS Constellation, the newest aircraft carrier in the Navy, coming to the Pacific for the first time. And we know that this is true because we have a volunteer. He's retired now, but he used to volunteer on board, named Bob Park, and he was on the Connie and saw Lexington go by. Now, why this is important is that Lexington has always claimed to be the first aircraft carrier of the United States Navy to conduct flight operations going around Cape Horn. But Connie was also there, and what did she do? Well, Connie has always very quietly been said nothing about this. She's always let us take this honor and has never objected to it. So I guess perhaps we still have the honor of being the first aircraft carrier to conduct flight operations around Cape Horn. But in any event, we went up the East Coast, put in at New York Naval Shipyard for an overhaul, but then in 1962, October, the Cuban Missile Crisis broke out. So we cut short our yard period, reported into Mayport, Florida, and took up duties associated with the Cuban Missile Crisis, with the blockade line. This was our last combat duty. Directly after this mission, after the Cuban Missile Crisis was over, we reported into Pensacola as our home port and took up duties in the Gulf of Mexico, training pilots to land and take off on aircraft carriers. We also did special jobs for the Navy. For instance, this was the aircraft carrier that vetted the Corsair II for carrier duty. And occasionally we'd also act as a photographic target for the Navy photography school. And we did other special jobs for the Navy like that, but most of the time we trained people to land and take off on an aircraft carrier. And we continued this until 1991, at which time the Navy was faced with a very serious concern. Either they were going to have to take this old, worn-out World War II carrier and put her in a shipyard and spend a large amount of money trying to upgrade her to something similar to a modern aircraft carrier, or they were going to have to put her out of service. By this time in history, the modern U.S. aircraft carriers were roughly twice the size of the Lexington. We've got 2 acres of flight deck when you look at it. They've got 4.5 acres. And in addition, they're all being powered nuclear. They all have nuclear power plants. And you cannot upgrade a ship to nuclear power. It's just the plants are too different. You have to start from the ground up. So it was considered to be the best use of taxpayers' money to put Lexington out of service. But because of her distinguished war record, 3rd most decorated carrier of the United States Navy, and because she is the last World War II carrier to go out of service, the Navy offered her as a museum instead of scrapping her. And in 1992, she came to Corpus Christi. In June of 92, was placed alongside the pier where she is now. In October of 92, opened as a museum and has been there for 30 years since. Thank you very much. Any questions?